Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Jasmine Lee. The NATO Leaders Summit has wrapped up with member nations committing to raise their defense spending from the current 2% of GDP to 5% by 2035. As conflicts continue to rage in the Middle East, some are beginning to ask, could the Taiwan Strait become the next major flashpoint? With global geopolitics in flux and Middle East still highly unstable, concerns are growing that the U.S. might shift its focus away from the Indo-Pacific. What would such pivot mean for Taiwan's security and the regional balance? Meanwhile, Taiwan President Lai Ching-te has called for forging national unity through democracy and spoke of removing impurities through electoral and recall processes. The remarks have stirred political debate. What exactly is the message behind these statements? Join us today are Huang Kuibo, National Cheng Kung University Department of Diplomacy professor, and Wendy Song, Atlantic Council Global China Hub non-resident fellow. Welcome to both of you on the show. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with G7 foreign minister on the sidelines of the NATO Summit, where discussion went beyond the airstrikes against Iran. They also emphasized the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and strengthening cooperation to counter China's destabilizing behavior in the South China Sea. So, Professor Huang, I want to start with you. How do you assess whether security in the Taiwan Strait is being integrated into the broader strategy of G7 and NATO?
The issue around in the Taiwan Strait has been reiterated by G7 and NATO. So we cannot say that these two organizations or institutions do not pay attention to the Taiwan Strait, and we cannot say either that they do not want to take care of this kind of security concern actually among many, many countries around the globe. However, I would say that like G7 or NATO, yes, they have kept their commitment to the security, peace, and stability in the Taiwan Strait. But it's also true that they cannot give much attention to the state of the Taiwan Strait relations.
It's too far away.
Yeah, it's too far away. And actually, they have had some other things also important, equally important, or more important to do. That is Russia.
Yeah.
So I would say, yes, it's good that G7 and NATO always said that peace and stability remain concerns of those participating parties. But I would say that I do not see many concrete measures or actions taken by those related parties. You know, U.S., yes, it has done a lot. Japan, in cooperation with the U.S., has done some. Then, who else?
But do you think the verbal support is also important?
Verbal support is important, and that's what I call political deterrence. It's not military deterrence. So by using political deterrence, can these G7 or NATO participating countries show their concern and show their support to those in the Taiwan Strait who do not destroy peace and stability? But again, that's just political deterrence. We also need to have military deterrence and political consultations between G7, NATO, and the Beijing authorities.
Yes.
And probably also including the Taipei government. So we can have a better plan or some foreseeable future in the Taiwan Strait. Otherwise, we can see on the one hand, the Beijing authorities is increasing its military pressure against Taiwan. On the other hand, G7, NATO are giving some political deterrence while not having some military deterrence, plus those necessary political consultation between the West and the Beijing authorities. That's not enough.
And Wendy, when the NATO is integrate Taiwan into their own strategy, do you think the U.S. play a role behind it?
Obviously, U.S.'s role is first among equals. That includes internationally, that includes especially NATO and North Atlantic community, more generally speaking. So I think obviously U.S. leadership here is important to the endeavor. And I think for NATO, of course, Yes, it does provide ongoing rhetorical support, which has some role in terms of normative policing, in terms of upholding the right kind of values. Militarily, yes, NATO does seem pretty far away from the Indo-Pacific theater for most intents and purposes. So I think what they are useful for in the foreseeable future will be making some kind of progress in terms of communication and coordination linkages, maybe during, let's hope it never gets to wartime, of course, but if it ever gets to very tense situation, then perhaps having some kind of mutual support system in place, be it in terms of repair and services and other agreements in place before anything goes down, will be useful as well when it comes to emergency responses, and it's good to have stuff in place beforehand.
Yeah, and the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, he highly praised the U.S. President Donald Trump on his decision to conduct precision airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, and he believed that the moves sent a clear message to Russia and China. So Wendy, do you agree with that? And how do you see U.S. balancing its security commitments in the Indo-Pacific while carrying out military operations in the Middle East?
Yeah, it's always going to be a challenging balancing act, of course, for the U.S. and for many other regional countries. Yeah. On the one hand, one of the justification for U.S.'s gradual, perhaps deceleration in terms of intensity of U.S. involvement in Ukraine. The talking point was that U.S. need to reprioritize much of the resources and attention towards the Indo-Pacific theater to focus on China, and therefore when you have U.S. certainly somehow starting and re-upping its involvement in the Middle East, that's going to be a potential issue somewhere in terms of integrity of that narrative. I think U.S. try to balance against that as much as it can by limiting the duration of its military strike against Iran. So the whole thing was over basically within 3 days. And at the moment we have a somewhat of a ceasefire or true situation going on over there, however potentially tenuous it may be. So I think it's how U.S. try to both make sure that A, it polices norms of nuclear non-proliferation, but also B, still try to maintain that it has enough attention, energies, and other things in reserve should anything in Indo-Pacific require more U.S. involvement.
And Professor Huang, how do you see U.S. foreign policy in balancing its focus between Middle East and Indo-Pacific?
I would argue that the U.S. is giving almost equal importance to these two regions.
Equal?
Yes, but in comparison with the Middle East, actually the Asia-Pacific, I think, is not that risky. Because now we have seen missiles, bombs, thrown all over each other, and that's true. So that's the urgent things that the U.S. and its allies needs to take care of for the time being. And in the Asia-Pacific, of course, we have seen a growing influence of mainland China on, say, the South Pacific island countries against Taiwan, and also in the South China Sea, for instance. But it's a developing condition where the U.S. still has some leverage against Beijing authorities, especially when the U.S. can work with its allies and like-minded partners in order to counter the growth of the PLA's or the Beijing authorities' influence. So both are kind of urgent, but I would say the U.S. of course needs to take care of the Middle East first. Otherwise, the spread of these negative Middle Eastern politics would drag U.S. into some uncertainty in which the U.S. needs to probably devote itself to the Middle East while ignoring some of the also very troublesome developments in the Asia-Pacific.
And a lot of people they are worried about, because back in Obama administration, the U.S. was talking about pivot to Asia. But at the end, because of the war in the Middle East and in Africa, the focus has been shifted back to the Middle East. Do you think that is going to happen this time?
Under the leadership of President Trump, I think that's possible because, see, President Trump hasn't mentioned Taiwan when it comes to the security of Taiwan. He always mentioned Taiwan when he talks about chips.
He's a businessman.
Business, yes. But when he talks about the Middle East, he has his own opinions.
Yeah.
So apparently, I would say maybe President Donald Trump has pivoted a little bit back to the Middle East because he cares more about the Middle East. And probably he thinks that he can speak to Xi Jinping to ease the tension in the Taiwan Strait. I think he still has such confidence, and we'll see.
And Wendy, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, for U.S., obviously, as always, going to be a challenging way to balance between how much resources put in every region in the world. And I think at this juncture, there are some encouraging signs here and there. Of course, we're seeing Japan, we're seeing many other U.S. cabinet secretaries like Marco Rubio, for example, as well as Pete Hegseth, both paying a lot of attention to the Indo-Pacific theater in a way that would be obviously a vote of confidence for many in the region. Marco Rubio has always been very sharply focused on the China issue, more broadly speaking. And even for Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, he made a point of make sure that he visit Australia as his first destination for his first international visit at the time when Australians are a little bit tentative about the upcoming AUKUS review, which is going to impact Australian security for many years to come. So in that sense, there are good signs. Where there may be room for improvement in a way, may be about style. We know style in the sense that, for example, when U.S. is asking NATO allies and really by extension many other Indo-Pacific forum and other equivalent friends and partners of the U.S. When U.S. asking them to increase in the defense spending from anywhere from 3.5 to 5%, depends on how you define the term. When that happened at the time when U.S.'s own strategic attention to the Indo-Pacific seemed to be slightly less completely certain than before. That's going to create a situation where that may not be the easiest sell. And indeed, we're seeing Japan, for example, allegedly recently canceling the originally scheduled Japan-U.S. 2+2, and that's the defense and foreign secretary meeting between U.S. and Japan as a way for Japan to signal dissension. Knowing Japan foreign policy tradition, that's usually not the most frequent sight, a protest of that magnitude and of that level of publicity. So I think there may be more room for U.S. side to handle with a bit more grace.
And Professor Huang, back to you. So we mentioned that now NATO is increasing their defense spending, and Trump is calling it a big win. And does this mean that Trump's Indo-Pacific suppression of the Chinese Communist Party strategy is working?
And it's hard to say whether or not Trump's strategy is working or effective, because we have to look at a lot of different indicators in order to say, yes, it's working or effective. And it's so hard to say that in foreign policy assessment or evaluation. So if I really want to say that, yes, President Donald Trump's strategy towards mainland China is working with the collaboration of NATO, I would say let's look at least the following three indicators. If all the three indicators happen, then I can say, yes, I think President Donald Trump's strategy is working. The first indicator, I would say, is a softer tone of the Beijing authorities towards Taiwan. Softer tone of Beijing authorities towards Taiwan. That is, under the pressure of U.S. and its allies in NATO, Beijing actually concedes, and Beijing would like to use some other strategies towards Taiwan in order not to in order not to bring up some unnecessary tension between Beijing and Washington and others. That's the first indicator. And the second indicator would be a decrease in the People's Liberation Army's presence in the Taiwan Strait or around Taiwan. Then I would say, okay, Donald Trump's strategy might be working. And the last but not least indicator here is some collective responses from those Europe-based NATO member states that actually stand up.
In the Taiwan Strait?
No, not necessarily be present in the Taiwan Strait, but all those collective responses from those Europe-based NATO member states that actually shows very clear messages collectively. I have to emphasize that, hey, Beijing, don't do something stupid on Taiwan. Okay, if all those three indicators happen, then I think Donald Trump might feel happy about, oh, I spent little and my strategy works.
So that will be the big win. And so for Wendy, what impact will the increase in NATO military spending have on the global strategic landscape?
Well, that's obviously in social science always difficult to predict the future, but I can see that with a stronger, more united, potentially more coherent NATO, one that's willing to put their money where their mouth is going to generate some meaningful collective deterrence effect against would-be offenders to the international rule-based order. For one, I think to some extent you could argue that Trump's sometimes tough rhetoric has the potential effect of what they call catfish effect, which is to use maximum pressure that somehow we're able to spur other actors, including friends and allies, into action in the form of increasing the defense spending. Of course, you can also argue that the fact that NATO states right now are actually increasing their defense spending pledges is a sign that there's awareness that prevention is better than cure. Better to put out resources now so that with perhaps increased deterrent, that could mean less amount of actual war fighting that will be needed. As to, if we go beyond military, however, and I think about political effect, I think one thing I will be concerned about is this balancing act between politics and military of defense spending increases. And that is, the world is still recovering from its post-COVID economic recovery in a sense. And so at the time when you're increasing the military spending dramatically, that may create some more political leeway for those populist, isolationist voices inside many Western democracies, including those on the far right, to gain a further political influence down the road. And we're seeing that in quite a number of European countries and recent elections already. So whether increased defense spending is going to further strengthen the argument that the resources going to the haves, the defense industrial complex and what have you, and whether that's going to lead to a longer term actually inward turn for these democracies down the road. I think that's an issue that we need to watch out for very carefully.
And regarding the escalation of the conflicts in the Middle East, Taiwan President Lai Ching-te stated that the need to strengthen dynamic monitoring of Taiwan Strait regional security when the Chinese military immediately launched a joint combat readiness patrol. This include 24 stories of various types of main and auxiliary combat aircraft, such as the Su-30s and KJ-500s, as well as drones conducting offshore activities. Among them, 15 stories crossed the medium line, entering Taiwan's central, southwestern, and eastern airspace. So, Professor Huang, what is the strategic objectives behind these actions from China, and how do Taiwan's allies interpret China's behavior?
It has been said that a lot of these drills conducted by the PLA are aimed at pressurizing the force of Taiwan independence and the so-called foreign intervention in the Taiwan Strait. That's the terms used by the Beijing authorities. That is why we have seen a lot of aircraft and vessels, flying or cruising around Taiwan, and a lot of them actually, when we are recording our programs, have intruded into the medium line in the Taiwan Strait. So that actually consists of a salient and immediate threat to the national security of the Republic of China, because once those vessels of PLA intrude over the median line in the Taiwan Strait, then within minutes, they could reach the seashore of the island of Taiwan. So can we respond in a timely manner? Do we have enough capability to respond? I think those are two big questions for the current DPP government.
But do you think China is using this to test if U.S. is still focusing on the Taiwan Strait?
In the past, I would say yes, but for the time being, I would say maybe mainland China has known that the U.S. wouldn't intervene in the Taiwan Strait when the PLA is exercising a huge military drill to threaten people in Taiwan, especially those in favor of Taiwan independence. So maybe it hasn't been a test, but as I said, it has been an attitude of the Beijing authorities to show to the people in Taiwan, if you are for Taiwan independence, then these trails are for you guys. And also another probably objective for these, many sorties of flights is, to familiarize the PLA around these war zones. That is, for example, in the eastern part of Taiwan, if the PLA pilots fly there more often, then they can get to know more about the environment. Once they are engaged in wars or armed conflict, then they can feel more confident in flying their vessels or controlling their vessels in the eastern part of Taiwan.
Yeah.
So that's very important. So the more the PLA comes to Taiwan or around Taiwan, then I think the greater level of familiarity of the PLA, and that is actually
they're rehearsal.
You can say it's rehearsal. So that's very dangerous for the national security. But can we do anything in Taiwan? I haven't seen.
And Wendy, do you think that's the test too? What's the target audience of China's military drills?
I think I agree that these military drills themselves have a certain intelligence gathering function when it comes to knowing about the oceanography of Taiwan Strait and surrounding waters, for example, weather pattern and whether PLA's current military assets are well suited to perform combat mission in those terrains. So in that sense, I think they do have an intelligence and war preparedness function to it. Moreover, however, I do think that China's military drill at this juncture will have more of a domestic focus in nature. And if you look at recent developments coming from the Chinese side, President Xi Jinping, for example, published a new article on July 1st on Qiushi magazine, that is the CCP Party Central magazine. That's formed the basis for a lot of doctrine coming out of the Communist Party, and in which he talked about there's a need for CCP comrades to, how do I translate this, to exhibit the spirit of struggle and to increase their ability at struggle. So in that sense, for just hours after publishing of a tailored new doctrine coming from the General Secretary, they have a new joint combat readiness patrol to show how PLA is putting their money where the mouth is, and they are really trying to honor the president's call for increasing the actual combat capability. So I think in that sense, there is a domestic audience in mind as well. I guess if we're going to talk about more of contingency consideration, I think at the end of the day, yes, U.S. involvement in Middle East is a factor there lurking in the background for sure, but I think ultimately China is a superpower. And a superpower, one hallmark of superpowerdom is that it does things largely according to its own timetable. So I think in this sense, I am not too worried just yet in terms of the linkage between Middle East and Indo-Pacific insecurity.
And at the last part of this show, let's talk about Taiwan. Taiwan President Lai Ching-te used the metaphor of democracy being forged into steel, stated that Taiwan's democracy needs continuous elections and recalls to remove impurities. Lai's remarks sparked controversies and debates in Taiwan. So, Wendy, how do you interpret the implication of his remarks?
So this is a remark about the third speech, I assume, right, about democracy and elections. Yes, I mean, that is a speech that is not without controversy. I understand that even the president's office later on apparently have added it part of the transcript after they publish it, for sure. But I think if we go beyond the specific wording, you look at the broader spirit of the speech from President Lai, what he's talking about is A, there's a need to strengthen Taiwan's democratic resiliency, and B, what's the means to go about doing it? He said through elections over and over. And that for him, election is still the ultimate and most important way to forge democratic will, one that is needed for deterrence and for many other endeavors as well. So I think that is a speech that is ultimately committed to the spirit of democracy, and he still sees that democratic election from below is much more important than anything remotely resembling ruling by decree from above. So I think on the whole, it's a good speech.
Okay, and Professor Huang, so one last question. So now, in the past year, Taiwan has been caught up in the partisan struggle. And how could this internal political climate influence Taiwan's foreign policy?
In the past, I think Taiwan possessed a very strong soft power, that is democracy. And we also always say that Taiwan is the beacon of democracy among all Chinese communities in the world. Okay, so my point is, if Taiwan's democracy is now got stuck in these recalls or anti-recalls, and everything in Taiwan has been so politicized, then I think the soft power of Taiwan will diminish. And so what else can Taiwan do in order to show to the rest of the world that Taiwan is a reliable partner, Taiwan is favorable friends for other countries? You know, economic power, of course, is important, but eventually we need to use both economic power, democratic power, in order to show to the people that, hey, we do not depend on military, but still we can contribute back to the world.
Thank you, Professor Huang and Wendy, for your great insights. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube and give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.